Some people are born with a shadow cast not by the sun, but by the weight of their name. You can spend years building a completely different life in a faraway place, believing you have escaped that fate. But then one day, as your old world falls into chaos, you realize that the shadow never went away. It was just waiting. This is the story of a man who lived for 20 years under the bright sun of Paris, only to be pulled back by the shadow of his name at the darkest moment in history. His name was Prince Kyril of Bulgaria. To understand the impossible situation Prince Kyril would one day inherit, you have to understand the precarious existence of his country. The Kingdom of Bulgaria in the early 20th century was a nation defined by its fierce independence, its bruised pride, and its unfortunate geography. It was a young kingdom born from the ashes of the Russo-Turkish War, having only broken free from 5 centuries of oppressive Ottoman rule in 1878. This liberation, achieved with the crucial help of the Russian Empire, created a deep and lasting yet often complicated bond between the two Slavic nations. But the great powers of Europe immediately intervened. At the Congress of Berlin, they carved up the newly liberated Bulgarian state, fearing the creation of a large Russian satellite in the Balkans. From its first day, modern Bulgaria learned a harsh lesson. It was not a kingdom, but a pawn, its fate decided by the whims of distant empires. Like many new nations of the era, Bulgaria looked to Germany for its new royal house. It was common practice to invite a German princeling to rule, as they were seen as neutral, well-connected, and hailing from a culture of military and administrative efficiency. After a brief and turbulent reign by its first prince, Bulgaria offered its throne to Kyril's father, Ferdinand of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Known to history as Foxy Ferdinand, he was a man of immense ambition, cunning, and an almost comical love for pomp and circumstance. He was a descendant of King Louis XIV of France, and he never let anyone forget it. He arrived in 1887 with a grand vision to transform Bulgaria from a Balkan backwater into a major European power, the Prussia of the Balkans. It was he who declared Bulgaria a fully independent kingdom in 1908, taking the ancient and glorious title of Tsar. He poured money into transforming the provincial town of Sofia into a grand European capital, complete with a royal palace, a national theater, and neo-Baroque architecture. This was the ambitious, high-stakes, and often theatrical political world into which Prince Kyril was born. This immense ambition would lead Bulgaria into 2 decades of almost constant conflict, a series of wars that would leave the nation deeply scarred and obsessed with a sense of historical grievance. In 1912, during the First Balkan War, Bulgaria and its allies achieved a stunning and glorious victory, driving the once mighty Ottoman Empire almost completely out of Europe. It was a moment of supreme national triumph, but the victors immediately fell to fighting amongst themselves over the spoils, particularly the coveted region of Macedonia. In the disastrous Second Balkan War of 1913, Ferdinand, feeling his country had been cheated of its rightful prize, launched a surprise attack on his former allies, Serbia and Greece. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Romania and the Ottoman Empire also attacked, and Bulgaria was quickly overwhelmed and defeated. It was forced to give up vast territories it had just won. Just 2 years later, seeking revenge, Tsar Ferdinand made his final fateful gamble. He allied Bulgaria with Germany and the Central Powers in the First World War. For Bulgaria, this was not about German aggression. It was a purely opportunistic war to get revenge on Serbia and reclaim Macedonia. After initial successes, the war bogged down into a brutal stalemate, and in 1918, Bulgaria shared in the utter defeat of the Central Powers. The unpopular Tsar Ferdinand was forced to abdicate and fled into exile, leaving his eldest son, Boris, to pick up the pieces. The subsequent Treaty of Neuilly-sur-Seine was yet another humiliation. Bulgaria was stripped of even more territory, including its vital access to the Aegean Sea, forced to pay crippling reparations, and its army was severely limited. These defeats, known collectively in Bulgaria as the national catastrophes, created a deep and burning national desire to one day reclaim these lost lands. This powerful undercurrent of nationalism and resentment would dominate Bulgarian politics for the next 2 decades. The new Tsar, Boris III, was the absolute opposite of his father. Where Ferdinand was flamboyant, autocratic, and had ruled from a distance, Boris was modest, cautious, and deeply connected to his people. He was famously a passionate botanist and a qualified locomotive driver, often delighting the public by taking the controls of a train himself. He became a genuinely beloved and unifying figure in a deeply fractured country. His reign was a constant struggle for survival. He had to navigate a treacherous political landscape of military coups, right-wing conspiracies, and the rise of a powerful communist movement. The 1920s were a period of extreme political violence. In 1925, he miraculously survived one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in interwar European history. During a general's funeral at the St. Nedelya Cathedral in Sofia, communists detonated a massive bomb in the dome. The roof collapsed, killing over 150 members of the country's political and military elite. Boris himself was running late for the service, a delay that saved his life. By the mid-1930s, to keep his fragile kingdom from tearing itself apart, Boris had established a form of royal dictatorship, banning political parties, and steering a middle course as the storm clouds of another world war gathered over Europe. And while Boris navigated this high-stakes drama, where was his younger brother? Prince Kyril was exactly where they both wanted him to be, living quietly in the shadow of the throne. While Boris, the burdened monarch, dedicated every waking hour to the survival of his nation, his younger brother Kyril was deliberately kept out of the corridors of power. He embraced the role of the classic playboy prince, an apolitical, carefree bachelor known more for his passion for high-speed motor cars than for any interest in the dangerous intrigues of Balkan politics. This arrangement suited both brothers perfectly. Boris had the political stage to himself, and Kyril was free from the crushing weight of the crown. But this quiet life in the shadows would make the moment he was suddenly thrust into the spotlight all the more terrifying for both him and his country. Prince Kyril of Bulgaria was born in 1895, the second son of Tsar Ferdinand. From the moment of his birth, his role within the dynasty was clearly defined. He was the spare. While his older brother Boris, as the heir to the throne, was subjected to a rigorous and demanding education in politics, military strategy, and diplomacy, Kyril was afforded a more relaxed and cosmopolitan upbringing. His path was that of a minor European prince, not a future king. He attended the National Military School in Sofia and completed his training at the Naval College, but these were seen as traditional rites of passage for a prince, not preparation for any serious command. His true passions were far more modern. He was a keen motorist, one of Bulgaria's first petrolheads, fascinated by the new technology of the automobile. He was often seen driving his own car at high speeds through the countryside, a symbol of a more modern, carefree lifestyle. He was, in the eyes of many, the classic playboy prince, polite, well-mannered, a pleasant dinner guest, but a man of little substance. This was not a reputation he fought against. On the contrary, he seemed to embrace it. The arrangement suited both brothers perfectly. Boris, the burdened monarch, had the political stage to himself, and Kyril was free from the dangerous responsibilities that came with the crown. His life was one of immense privilege without the crushing weight of expectation. But while Kyril enjoyed his quiet life, his brother, Tsar Boris, was walking the most dangerous tightrope in Europe. By 1943, the tide of the Second World War had turned decisively against the Axis powers. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, had been annihilated at Stalingrad in February, after a grueling 6-month battle that began in August 1942, resulting in over 1.5 million total casualties on both sides, with the Germans losing 91,000 prisoners and marking the first major defeat for Hitler on the Eastern Front, boosting Soviet morale and shifting momentum toward the Allies. The Allies had invaded Italy, starting with the successful Operation Husky in Sicily on July 9th, involving over 160,000 troops from the U.S., Britain, and Canada, followed by mainland landings at Salerno and Taranto in September, which accelerated the collapse of Axis control in the Mediterranean. Mussolini's fascist regime had collapsed on July 25th, when the Grand Council of Fascism voted to remove him, leading to his arrest by King Victor Emmanuel III and the formation of a new government under Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who secretly negotiated an armistice with the Allies signed on September 3rd. Bulgaria, as a reluctant ally of Germany since signing the Tripartite Pact on March 1, 1941, under pressure from Hitler, who threatened invasion if refused, was in an increasingly perilous position, having used the alliance to occupy parts of Yugoslavia and Greece without declaring war on the major allies, but now facing economic strain from inflation, resource shortages, and growing partisan resistance in occupied territories like Macedonia. Tsar Boris was a master of diplomatic maneuvering throughout the conflict. He had joined the Axis in 1941 for one reason: to peacefully reclaim the territories Bulgaria had lost in previous wars, successfully regaining southern Dobruja from Romania through the Treaty of Craiova on September 7, 1940, which involved population exchanges of 110,000 people, and later occupying western Thrace from Greece and Vardar, Macedonia, from Yugoslavia in April 1941, following the German invasion of those countries, adding 1.2 million inhabitants and fulfilling nationalist aspirations without direct Bulgarian combat against British or American forces. But he had resisted Hitler's most critical demands at every turn, skillfully navigating the alliance to minimize involvement. He refused to send a single Bulgarian soldier to die fighting against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front, knowing the deep pro-Russian sentiment of his people stemming from the 1878 liberation, and shared cultural ties which could trigger mass unrest or military mutiny if violated. Instead, he maintained formal neutrality with the USSR, avoiding a declaration of war despite German insistence in meetings from 1941 to 1943. And most famously, he had successfully resisted Hitler's orders to deport Bulgaria's 50,000 Jewish citizens to the death camps in Poland, employing a series of delays, exemptions for economically vital Jews in labor battalions building roads and railways, and leveraging public protests from Orthodox church leaders like Metropolitan Stefan of Sofia and politicians like Dimitar Peshev, who in March 1943 gathered 43 parliamentary signatures against deportations, halting trains already loaded with 11,000 Jews from occupied Thrace and Macedonia, though those were sent to Treblinka, resulting in 11,343 deaths. Boris's tactics included vague promises to Hitler during summits, internal decrees suspending actions, and using Bulgaria's sovereignty to protect its core Jewish population, saving nearly all 48,000 in pre-war borders, an act later recognized by Israel with the righteous among the nations, honor for key figures involved. This defiance had infuriated the Führer, who viewed Bulgaria's half-hearted commitment as betrayal amid mounting losses. By August 1943, Hitler's patience had run out, as German resources stretched thin with defeats in North Africa at El Alamein in October 1942 and the Kursk offensive failure in July 1943. He summoned Tsar Boris to his headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, a fortified complex in the Masurian woods, for a tense and reportedly stormy meeting on August 14th to 15th. While no official transcript of their conversation exists, accounts from those present, including Bulgarian interpreter Drago Draganov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, describe a furious confrontation lasting several hours in the bunker's conference room. Hitler raged at the Tsar, pounding the table and demanding a full commitment to the war effort, including declaring war on the Soviet Union, sending troops to the front, and accelerating Jewish deportations to meet quotas for extermination camps like Auschwitz. Boris, in his quiet but firm way, refused each point, citing Bulgaria's historical ties to Russia, internal stability risks, and moral objections, while emphasizing his loyalty through occupation duties. He left the Wolf's Lair visibly shaken. The defiant Tsar had walked into the lion's den, and though he had not been eaten, he had been mauled. He returned to Sofia by air on August 16th aboard a Junkers Ju-52, and upon landing at Vrazhdebna Airport, he seemed fine, briefly meeting with Prime Minister Bogdan Filov before retiring to Vrana Palace. But within a matter of hours, by evening, he was struck by a sudden, violent, and mysterious illness. His condition declined with terrifying speed. On the 28th of August, 1943, Tsar Boris III, the beloved leader and protector of his nation, was dead. He was just 49 years old. The official cause of death, announced by the German doctors, was a heart attack, but almost no one in Bulgaria believed it. The timing was too perfect, too convenient for Hitler. Had the Tsar been poisoned? The Bulgarian doctors who conducted the autopsy suspected a rare, slow-acting poison that was designed to mimic the symptoms of a heart attack. An Italian doctor who was consulted agreed. The question has never been definitively answered and remains one of the great mysteries of the war. But in the hearts of the Bulgarian people there was no doubt. Their Tsar had been murdered. The sudden death of the beloved monarch threw Bulgaria into a state of profound crisis. The nation was now leaderless, in the middle of a world war, and trapped between the vengeful Nazis and the advancing Soviet Red Army. The heir to the throne was Boris's son, Simeon, who was just 6 years old. A child could not rule. According to the Constitution, a regency council had to be formed to govern in the young Tsar's name until he came of age. A new prime minister was chosen, and a cabinet was formed. But the question remained, who would head the council? Who would become the de facto ruler of Bulgaria? In this moment of supreme national peril, the politicians looked not for a strong man or a brilliant statesman, but for a symbol of continuity, a figure from the royal house who could hold the nation together. There was only one choice. In an instant, the man who had spent his entire life avoiding power now held the fate of his nation in his hands. The apolitical, inexperienced playboy Prince Kyril was appointed head of the Regency Council. The quiet life of the Shadow Prince was over. He was now the reluctant regent, forced to take his brother's place and navigate the apocalyptic storm that was about to break over his country. This was a role for which he was utterly and completely unprepared. He was an unassuming man of simple tastes who had always preferred the quiet of the countryside at his Black Sea residence, where he spent days reading or walking trails, and the mechanics of a motor car disassembling engines in his workshop for relaxation, to the dangerous intrigues of the palace involving factional plots among advisors or secret negotiations with envoys. He lacked his brother's natural charisma that captivated crowds during public appearances. His deep political cunning developed through years of balancing dictatorships, and his almost mystical connection with the Bulgarian people built on gestures like driving trains or botanical expeditions. Contemporary accounts from foreign diplomats, such as British envoy George Rendell's dispatches to London describing Kyril as anxious and indecisive in meetings, and government ministers like Bogdan Filov's diary entries noting his hesitant demeanor during council sessions, are unanimous in their assessment of him during this time. They describe a man who was nervous, often pausing mid-sentence in discussions, hesitant, deferring key decisions to others, and often visibly overwhelmed by the immense responsibility that had been thrust upon him, with physical signs like sweating or fidgeting during audiences with German officials. His primary and perhaps only political strategy was to simply try and continue his brother's delicate and dangerous balancing act between Axis demands and national preservation. The question that reportedly dominated his every decision, repeated like a desperate mantra in the halls of the palace during daily briefings in the ornate council room, was, what would Boris have done? Drawing on notes from Boris's aides for guidance on issues like armistice talks. He sought to walk the same impossible tightrope, to appease the Germans just enough to avoid a full-scale occupation by allowing transit of troops and supplies to the Greek front, while desperately seeking a way to extricate Bulgaria from the war before the Soviets arrived at their border through covert contacts with Allied representatives in Istanbul. But Kyril was not Boris. He did not have the same skill in subtle diplomacy honed over decades, the same nerve to defy direct threats from Hitler, or the same authority to command respect from both his own people, who saw him as a temporary figure, and the formidable powers abroad like the German High Command. He was a man trying to follow the ghost of a king, a ghost who was a far more masterful politician than he could ever hope to be, resulting in delayed responses that exacerbated tensions. The power dynamics within the Regency Council itself only highlighted his weakness. While he was the royal figurehead, presiding over sessions as the nominal chair with the symbolic authority of the monarchy, the other two members were seasoned and ruthless political operators. The hawkish general Nicola Mihov, a staunch Germanophile who had risen through the ranks. As war minister, advocating for closer ties with Berlin through arms deals, and the shrewd, ambitious Prime Minister, Bogdan Filov, an academic-turned politician who maneuvered alliances with pro-Axis factions to maintain control. In the crucial smoke-filled meetings where the fate of the nation was decided, often held in the palace's war room with maps and telegrams scattered on tables, the quiet, uncertain prince was often overshadowed by the more forceful and decisive men around him, with Mihov pushing for military concessions to Germany and Filov handling economic policies, leaving Kyril to endorse rather than initiate plans. He was a man tasked with finishing a deadly chess game his brother had started, but he barely knew the rules. He wasn't just in his brother's shadow, he was drowning in it, like the German ambassador, with the very existence of his country as the prize, as missteps risked invasion or internal collapse. The psychological toll of this unwanted power was immense. The carefree bachelor who had once spent his days driving his car along coastal roads for leisure and attending social events with European nobility now spent his nights poring over diplomatic cables from neutral countries and military reports on troop movements he struggled to fully comprehend, often requiring explanations from staff late into the evening. He was caught in an impossible geopolitical vice. In the West, there was Nazi Germany, a powerful and increasingly demanding ally, now deeply suspicious of Bulgaria after the Tsar's death, fearing defection amid their losses. This suspicion was personified in Sofia by the menacing German ambassador, Adolf Heinz Kyril, a former SA officer and ardent Nazi who constantly pressured the Regency to commit more to the war effort through demands for additional labor battalions or harsher anti-partisan measures. Kyril was forced to endure tense, unpleasant meetings in the embassy's formal rooms, where he would be berated for perceived disloyalty and implicitly threatened with reprisals like economic blockades. In the East, the tide of the war had turned with Soviet victories at Kursk and Kharkov. The Soviet Red Army was advancing relentlessly through Ukraine and Romania, and Kyril knew it was only a matter of time before they reached the Bulgarian border in late 1944, potentially leading to occupation. He was haunted by the knowledge that a single wrong move, such as premature surrender talks leaked to Germans, could invite an invasion from either side, devastating the country. This constant, unbearable stress was compounded by his profound personal isolation. His brother had been his only true confidant, the one he turned to for advice on personal matters during private family retreats. Now he was surrounded by politicians and generals in the Regency offices, but he was utterly alone in bearing the ultimate responsibility, with advisors offering biased counsel tied to their agendas. His lifelong bachelorhood, once a symbol of his carefree lifestyle, now meant he lacked the intimate support of a wife and family that his brother had with Queen Giovanna, who had provided emotional stability during crises. He faced this supreme crisis with no one to turn to for personal comfort or unbiased advice, relying instead on formal consultations that left him more anxious. Every public appearance became a performance, an attempt to project a regal confidence and authority that he simply did not feel, such as delivering speeches to the nation on radio with prepared text to mask his hesitation. The charming, easygoing prince was gone, replaced by a haunted, anxious man, trapped by a duty he had never sought and for which he was tragically and fatally ill-equipped. Prince Kyril inherited a poisoned chalice. The legacy left to him by his brother, Tsar Boris III, was not one of clear directives and stable alliances, but of dangerous ambiguities and masterful deceptions. The central feature of this dangerous masterpiece was the devil's bargain he had struck with Nazi Germany. To understand the impossible choices Kyril's regency faced, we must first understand this bargain in all its complexity. In exchange for Hitler's help in peacefully reclaiming the territories of Macedonia and Thrace, the great burning national dream of a greater Bulgaria, Boris had aligned his kingdom with the Axis powers, but he was a deeply uncooperative and frustrating partner for the Third Reich. He had infuriated Hitler by steadfastly refusing to send a single Bulgarian soldier to fight and die against the Soviet Union, knowing the deep pro-Russian sentiment of his people. And, most critically, he had engaged in a brilliant and dangerous game of delay and defiance to resist Germany's demands to deport Bulgaria's 50,000 Jewish citizens. Kyril, a man with none of his brother's political genius, was now forced to continue this high-wire act with the menacing German ambassador in Sofia, Adolf Heinz Kyril, and the ruthless SS representative, Theodor Daniker, watching his every move. The story of the Holocaust in Bulgaria is one of the most complex and paradoxical of the entire war. It is a story of both profound shame and extraordinary courage, and Kyril's regency was caught right in the middle of it. The dark chapter began in early 1943, just before Boris's death. Under immense pressure from Berlin, the Bulgarian government, led by the notorious Commissar for Jewish Affairs, Alexander Belev, agreed to cooperate with the Nazis, but with a crucial distinction. They agreed to deport the Jews from the newly occupied territories of Thrace in Greece and Macedonia in Yugoslavia. 11,343 people were not considered Bulgarian citizens and thus had no legal protection. In March 1943, in a brutal and efficient operation, Bulgarian police and soldiers rounded up entire Jewish communities. Men, women, and children were forced from their homes, herded into temporary concentration points, and then marched to the Danube River, port of Lom. There, they were handed over to the Germans, forced onto barges, and sent on their final journey to the Treblinka extermination camp in Poland. Almost none of them survived. It is a dark and shameful stain on the nation's history, an act of collaboration for which the Bulgarian state was directly responsible. But what happened next is what makes this story so unique. Flushed with the success of this operation, the Nazi officials and their Bulgarian collaborators prepared the trains for the next phase, the deportation of the first 8,000 Jews from within Bulgaria proper, starting with the community in the town of Kyustendil. The secret orders were issued, the trains were waiting, and then the nation resisted. The spark of defiance was lit by 4 ordinary citizens from Kyustendil who, having learned of the secret plan, undertook a desperate journey to Sofia to warn their local member of parliament, Dimitar Peshev. Peshev, who was also the deputy speaker of parliament, was horrified. In an act of incredible political courage, he broke with his own pro-German government. He drafted a petition protesting the deportation, and in a single frantic night convinced 42 other MPs to sign it, before confronting the Prime Minister himself. At the same time, the leaders of the powerful Bulgarian Orthodox Church rose up in an act of profound moral courage. Metropolitan Stefan of Sofia began using his sermons to condemn the government's actions, offering to baptize Jews to protect them. In the city of Plovdiv, the local bishop, Metropolitan Kyril, took even more direct action. He burst into the school where the city's Jews were being held for processing, pushed past the guards, and told the police chief that he would go on the trains with his flock. He sent a blistering telegram to Tsar Boris, threatening mass civil disobedience and declaring that the church would open its doors to protect the Jewish people. Faced with this united front of opposition from his parliament, his church, and the general public, Tsar Boris III made his fateful decision. He defied Adolf Hitler. He canceled the deportation orders. The 50,000 Jews of Bulgaria were saved from the gas chambers. So, throughout these momentous and fateful events, where was Prince Kyril, the reluctant regent? And what was he thinking? History often records actions, but it overlooks the whispers of the soul. To understand him, we must step into his office in the palace, a space where the shadow of his deceased brother, Tsar Boris, loomed over everything. Every decision, every signature, every meeting was haunted by a single, desperate question, a mantra of his own inadequacy. What would Boris have done in this situation? When the first reports of the deportation of 11,343 Jews from the occupied territories of Thrace and Macedonia landed on his desk, did Kyril know? Almost certainly, yes. As the head of the Regency Council, it is impossible that an operation of this magnitude could have proceeded without his knowledge. But to know did not mean to act. Surrounded by powerful pro-German ministers like Bogdan Filov, who saw cooperation with the Nazis as a prerequisite for survival, Kyril likely felt completely powerless. He, a man never prepared to rule, was confronted with a demand from a power that even his genius brother had to handle with extreme caution. It is highly probable that he signed the approval documents in silence, viewing it as a cruel but unavoidable price to pay to appease Hitler, a shameful act of compliance in exchange for the fragile existence of his kingdom. This was not the action of an evil man, but of a weak one, completely overwhelmed. And then the resistance erupted from his own people. The news of Dimitar Peshev's petition and the church's open defiance arrived at the palace not as a relief, but as a new nightmare. Kyril was now trapped between two immense fears. On one side was the fury of Hitler and the Nazi regime, a force that could crush Bulgaria at any moment. On the other side was the fury of his own people, his parliament, and his church, a force that could ignite an immediate civil war. Was he passive in the face of this resistance, or did he secretly support it? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. He was not the author of this defiance, but the courage of others gave him an unexpected way out. The cancellation of the deportation orders was not an act born of his own moral courage, but a pragmatic choice born of fear. The fear of an immediate internal uprising was greater than the fear of a future reprisal from Berlin. He took the path of least resistance at home, and that path, by a twist of fate, happened to be the morally correct one. So was continuing his brother's policy of saving the Jews a moral burden for him? Almost certainly, but perhaps not in the way we might think. For Tsar Boris, saving the Jews was a struggle born of personal conviction and shrewd political cunning. For Kyril, it became a heavy legacy he was forced to carry. Every day after that decision, he had to live in a state of constant terror. Every meeting with the German ambassador Beckerl was a psychological ordeal where he had to face accusations of disloyalty and threats of retaliation. He was trapped, forced to uphold a heroic policy that he himself lacked the strength or the conviction to initiate. He was wearing a crown of courage borrowed from his dead brother, and its weight was nearly crushing him. The tragedy of Prince Kyril was not just that he was forced to hold a power he never wanted, it was that he was forced to be a hero that, by his nature, he was not. This was the extraordinary situation that Prince Kyril's regency inherited in August 1943. And to their credit, for the next year and a half, they continued this policy of defiance. Despite continuous and immense pressure from the German embassy in Sofia, despite threats and intimidation, Kyril's government did not hand over a single Bulgarian Jew. This is the great paradox of his time in power. He was the head of a pro-fascist, pro-German government that, on this one crucial issue, defied the central genocidal project of its powerful ally. He presided over a country where the Jews were still subjected to harsh and humiliating anti-Semitic laws, but their lives were spared. By the summer of 1944, the delicate balancing act that had defined Bulgaria's survival had become impossible. The world had changed, and the walls were closing in on Prince Kyril and his regency as Allied advances accelerated and Axis defeats mounted, leaving Bulgaria exposed on multiple fronts with its 1941 territorial gains in Macedonia and Thrace now vulnerable to reversal. In the west, the D-Day landings in Normandy on June 6th had opened a new front involving over 156,000 Allied troops, storming 5 beaches in the largest amphibious operation in history, leading to the liberation of Paris by August 25th and putting relentless pressure on German resources already strained by the Eastern Front. In the East, the Soviet Red Army's summer offensive, Operation Bagration, launched on June 22nd, had utterly annihilated the German Army Group Center, destroying 28 of 34 divisions and inflicting over 400,000 casualties in Belarus, the worst German defeat of the war. The Soviets were now advancing relentlessly, pushing through Ukraine in Operation Lvov-Sandomierz, starting July 13th, capturing key cities like Lviv and crossing into Poland and then into Romania with rapid gains. In late August, the Romanian capital, Bucharest, fell on August 31st after King Michael's coup on August 23rd switched Romania to the Allies, leading to the arrest of pro-German leaders and the Red Army's swift occupation. The Red Army was now massed directly on Bulgaria's northern border along the Danube River, with divisions like the 3rd Ukrainian Front positioned for invasion, their artillery and tanks within striking distance of Bulgarian soil. For the government in Sofia, the sound of Soviet tanks rumbling from positions in Giurgiu and Oltenita was no longer a distant rumble. It was an immediate existential threat, with intelligence reports warning of imminent crossing if Bulgaria did not capitulate. Inside Bulgaria, the authority of the Regency was crumbling under internal pressures. The communist partisans, emboldened and supplied by the advancing Soviets through airdrops of weapons and agents parachuted into the Rhodope Mountains, stepped up their attacks, disrupting communication lines by sabotaging railways like the Sofia-Varna route, and assassinating government officials in ambushes that claimed dozens of local administrators and police in July-August alone. The Bulgarian people, while grateful to have been spared the worst of the war through Boris's policies avoiding direct combat on major fronts, were exhausted from rationing, blackouts, and inflation soaring to 300%, and knew that the German cause was lost after Stalingrad and Normandy, fostering widespread defeatism, evident in desertions from the army reaching 10,000 by mid-1944. Prince Kyril, a man who had never wanted power, was now faced with the terrifying prospect of being the leader who would preside over the complete destruction of his country as partisan uprisings spread to cities like Plovdiv and Varna. A frantic, desperate race against time began, with emergency council meetings held daily in the royal palace to explore exit strategies. The Regency's only hope was to perform a dramatic U-turn and somehow switch sides, abandoning the Axis alliance forged in 1941. They made secret contact with the Western allies through intermediaries in neutral Turkey, where Bulgarian diplomats in Istanbul met British agents, and Cairo, Egypt, via encrypted messages to Allied headquarters, proposing terms for surrender. Their desperate plea was for a separate peace, offering to demobilize German units and provide bases to the Allies. They hoped to surrender to the British and the Americans, and to have Anglo-American forces occupy their country through airborne landings or naval support from the Black Sea, thereby creating a buffer against the approaching Soviets and preventing communist takeover. At the same time, they began to publicly and definitively break with their Nazi allies. In late August, on August 26th, the Regency formally declared Bulgaria's complete neutrality in the German-Soviet War via a radio broadcast and note to Berlin, withdrawing from active participation in Axis operations. More dramatically, they demanded that all German troops on Bulgarian soil, numbering around 20,000 in transit and garrison roles, be disarmed or leave the country immediately, issuing ultimatums to unit commanders. This led to tense standoffs between Bulgarian and German army units across the country, with incidents like the disarming of a German battalion in Varna on August 28th and negotiations to avoid clashes in Burgas. In a final desperate gesture to prove their good intentions to the Allies, a new staunchly pro-Western government was formed on September 2nd under Prime Minister Konstantin Muraviev, made up of politicians from the Democratic Alliance who had opposed the alliance with Germany since 1941, including figures like Nikola Mushanov, pledging immediate armistice talks. But it was all far too little, far too late. The Western Allies were sympathetic, but they were powerless to intervene. Geographically, their armies were hundreds of miles away, fighting in Italy and France. More importantly, in the cold, hard calculus of geopolitics, Bulgaria's fate had already been decided. At the conferences in Tehran and Yalta, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin had tacitly divided post-war Europe into spheres of influence. Bulgaria had been assigned to the Soviet sphere. Joseph Stalin, the master of the Kremlin, watched the regency's frantic maneuvering with a cynical eye. He had no interest in an independent, neutral, or pro-Western Bulgaria on his southern flank. He wanted a communist satellite state, a new loyal piece for his growing post-war empire. He saw Bulgaria's declaration of neutrality not as a step towards peace, but as a threat to his own ambitions. In a move of breathtaking cynicism, on September 5, 1944, the Soviet Union officially declared war on Bulgaria, despite no prior hostilities between the two nations. It was a bizarre and surreal moment, as Bulgaria had carefully avoided direct conflict with the Soviets throughout the war, maintaining full diplomatic relations with Moscow, even while allied with the Axis powers since 1941, including exchanges of ambassadors and trade agreements that underscored the complex historical ties rooted in Russia's role in Bulgaria's 1878 liberation from Ottoman rule. But the declaration gave Stalin the legal pretext he needed to justify military intervention, allowing the Red Army to advance without the appearance of unprovoked aggression, especially as Bulgaria had begun distancing itself from Germany through neutrality declarations and demands for troop withdrawals in late August. The Red Army immediately crossed the Danube and began its invasion, with Soviet forces from the Third Ukrainian Front, under Marshal Fyodor Tolbukin, moving into northern Bulgaria on September 8th, encountering minimal opposition as they occupied cities like Rus and Varna within days. The Bulgarian army, comprising about 450,000 troops still mobilized from earlier occupations of Macedonia and Thrace, under strict orders from the Regency Council and Prime Minister Konstantin Muraviev not to fire on their traditional Russian liberators, offered no resistance, leading to a bloodless advance where units either surrendered or stood down, reflecting the pro-Russian sentiment among many soldiers and officers influenced by pan-Slavic ideologies and Orthodox shared heritage. In many towns, such as Dobrich and Silistra along the border, the Soviet troops were greeted not as invaders, but with flowers and bread by a confused and hopeful populace who still saw Russia as their protector, drawing on memories of 1878 and viewing the arrival as liberation from German influence rather than occupation, with local committees organizing welcomes complete with traditional salt and bread ceremonies. This was the final checkmate. Prince Kyril's desperate gamble to save his country and its monarchy had failed spectacularly, as his efforts to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies through secret channels in Istanbul and Cairo, including pleas for Anglo-American occupation to buffer against the Soviets, yielded no response amid the Allies' deference to Stalin's sphere of influence as agreed at Yalta earlier that year. He had tried to walk the impossible tightrope between Hitler and Stalin, appeasing Germany with limited cooperation, like allowing troop transits, while resisting deeper involvement, and maintaining neutrality with the USSR to avoid provoking invasion. But in the end, both had turned against him, Hitler through suspicions of betrayal leading to Boris's alleged poisoning, and Stalin through opportunistic declaration to secure the Balkans. The German ship had sunk with the Wehrmacht's retreats across Europe. But instead of finding a Western lifeboat through failed armistice overtures, Bulgaria had been picked up by the Soviet battleship, ensuring communist dominance. The Soviet invasion was underway, with over 500,000 troops flooding in, and a Soviet-backed communist coup was now just days away on September 9, orchestrated by the Fatherland Front coalition, including communists, agrarians, and socialists who seized power in Sofia. The fate of the reluctant regent was sealed. The Soviet invasion of Bulgaria on September 8, 1944, was the final fatal blow to the fragile government of the Regency. It was a strange and almost surreal invasion, with the Bulgarian army under strict orders not to fire upon their traditional Russian liberators, and many common people greeting the Red Army with flowers, unaware of the grim future that was arriving with them. That very night, as Soviet tanks consolidated their control of the country, the political ground in Sofia shifted with seismic force. A coalition of communists, radical agrarians, and leftist army officers, known as the Fatherland Front, staged a Soviet-backed coup d'etat. It was a swift and meticulously planned seizure of power. With the Red Army on their side, they faced no resistance. Pro-communist military units known as the Zveno Group took control of the Ministry of War, the telephone and telegraph exchanges, the radio station, and other key government buildings in the capital. For Prince Kyril, the end came quickly and quietly. In the early hours of the morning, soldiers of the new regime arrived at the Vrana Palace. He, along with the other leaders of the royal government, Prime Minister Bogdan Filov and General Nikola Mihov, were immediately arrested. There was no struggle. The monarchy of the 6-year-old Tsar Simeon II was not yet officially abolished. That would come 2 years later. But in reality, its power had been extinguished in a single night. The era of communist rule in Bulgaria had begun, and with it, a period of brutal political revenge known as the Red Terror. In the months that followed the coup, the new communist-dominated regime directed by agents from Moscow was determined to eradicate every trace of the old order. A terrifying wave of arrests and purges swept across the country. This was not random violence. It was a systematic effort to decapitate the nation's pre-war elite. Tens of thousands of people, politicians, army officers, intellectuals, priests, journalists, and business owners who were associated with the former government were rounded up by newly formed militias. Many were summarily executed without any trial at all, their bodies dumped in unmarked graves or thrown into ravines. It was a time of terror designed to break the spirit of the old Bulgarian establishment and secure the Communist Party's absolute grip on power. To give their revenge a thin veneer of legality, the new regime established a series of people's courts. These were not real courts of law with impartial judges and due process. They were instruments of political terror, show trials based on the model of Stalin's purges in the 1930s, designed to condemn, not to judge. The judges and prosecutors were not legal experts. They were party loyalists, factory workers, and farmers, handpicked for their political fervor. The verdicts for the most high-profile defendants were decided in Moscow long before the trials even began. The most prominent of these was trial number 1, which put the entire former leadership of the nation on trial for their lives. The proceedings were held in a large lecture hall at Sofia University. In the dock sat Prince Kyril, the two other regents, dozens of former government ministers, royal advisors, and leading members of parliament. It was a gathering of the ghosts of a world that had ceased to exist just months before. They were charged with a host of crimes, from dragging Bulgaria into the war on the side of fascism to being enemies of the people and monarcho-fascist criminals. The indictment was a work of political propaganda designed to paint the entire pre-war establishment with the single broad brush of fascism. The profound and bitter irony of the trial was that the very men who had successfully saved Bulgaria's 50,000 Jews from the Holocaust were now being tried as fascist war criminals, accused of the very crime they had defied. But the complex reality of their wartime policies was a nuance that their accusers and the new world order they represented had no interest in acknowledging. Justice was not the goal. Retribution was. The stage was set for the final tragic act in the life of the reluctant regent. The show trial of Bulgaria's former leadership, known as Trial Number 1, began in late 1944 in a large cold lecture hall at Sofia University. The atmosphere was not one of sober justice, but of a political rally culminating in a predetermined verdict. The hall was packed with Communist Party loyalists who would cheer the prosecutors and jeer the defendants. Prince Kyril, dressed in worn civilian clothes, sat silently in the dock alongside the men who had, just months earlier, governed the nation with him. They were gaunt and pale after months of imprisonment and interrogation. The prosecution's case was a work of pure political theater. It was not based on evidence, but on sweeping ideological denunciations. The prosecutors, shouting into the radio microphones that broadcast the proceedings across the nation, painted the defendants as a monolithic block of fascist murderers, German puppets, and enemies of the Bulgarian people. They were blamed for the war, for the economy, for every ill that had befallen the nation. The defense was a tragic farce. The state-appointed lawyers were either intimidated into silence or were party members themselves who made only the most token efforts to defend their clients. When they attempted to introduce evidence that complicated the prosecution's narrative, for instance, the extensive documentation of the Regency's successful efforts to save Bulgaria's 50,000 Jews from the Holocaust, they were promptly overruled by the people's judges. Throughout the proceedings, contemporary accounts describe Prince Kyril as being remarkably calm and dignified. He was a man who knew he was doomed. He had been the head of a pro-German government, and in the new Soviet-dominated world, that was an unpardonable sin. He listened to the wild accusations against him with a quiet, almost detached resignation. He did not beg, he did not plead. He simply sat and awaited the inevitable. The end came on the night of February 1st, 1945. The city of Sofia was under a strict military curfew. The final verdicts were to be delivered. The chief judge began to read the long list of names of the more than 100 defendants. After each name, he pronounced the same single word, death. In the courtroom, the condemned men stood in grim silence as their fate was sealed. There was no right of appeal. The sentence was to be carried out immediately. That same night, the condemned men were taken from the courthouse. They were denied a final meeting with their families, denied the comfort of a priest. They were stripped of all their personal belongings. They were then loaded onto a canvas-covered truck and driven through the dark, frozen streets of the capital city they had once ruled. Their destination was a large bomb crater on the outskirts of Sofia, near the Orlandovci cemetery. It was a raw, gaping wound in the earth, a scar left from an Allied bombing raid months earlier. There, in the freezing cold of the February night, under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the truck's headlights, the men were forced out. They were shot one by one, or in small groups, by a firing squad from the People's Militia. Their bodies were unceremoniously pushed into the crater. The next day, the mass grave was covered over with slag and leveled. It was a brutal, ignominious end, designed to erase them not just from life, but from memory. There would be no graves, no memorials, no trace. The man who was never meant to rule, the reluctant regent who had presided over one of the most complex and paradoxical chapters in his country's history, was gone. This act of political violence was more than just the death of a prince and a group of politicians. It was the symbolic death of the old Bulgaria. The People's Court trials were one of the most sweeping and brutal political purges in post-war Europe, effectively decapitating the nation's entire pre-war political and intellectual class. This final bloody act secured the Communist Party's absolute grip on power in Bulgaria, a grip they would hold for the next 45 years. The story of Prince Kyril's death is, in many ways, the story of the birth of Communist Bulgaria. The final verdict on Prince Kyril is not a political one, but a human tragedy. He was, by all accounts, a man cruelly miscast by fate, a decent and unassuming person who desired only a private life, yet found himself trapped by a duty he never sought and a power he could not control. His legacy is therefore defined by a profound and bitter contradiction that history has struggled to reconcile. His government was a collaborator with the Axis, yet it is remembered for one of the most remarkable acts of defiance against the Holocaust. He was condemned as a fascist criminal, yet his defiance on this single issue stands as an extraordinary paradox. Ultimately, the answer may be that Kyril himself was simply a minor player in a game of giants. He was caught between the grinding impersonal gears of Nazism and communism, two of history's most monstrous ideologies. In the end, he was a quiet man caught in the crossfire of history, a prince who never wanted a crown, but was forced to pay its ultimate price,